Imagine a trauma surgeon being legally banned from treating their own dying spouse.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's heavy.
Right. Like, not just discouraged because of a conflict of interest or something, but fundamentally forbidden,
Right.
under the threat of losing their medical license and, their entire standing in the community.
It honestly sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It really does. But the crazy thing is, 3,000 years ago, this level of intense, almost unimaginable personal sacrifice it was the daily reality for Israel's spiritual leaders.
Yeah, everyday life for them.
Exactly. So welcome to today's deep dive. But before we really jump into exploring our sources, I just want to extend a very warm welcome directly to you listening right now.
Yes, welcome.
May God bless your day today, and may his grace, wisdom, and peace be with you throughout your entire week ahead. We are just so glad you are joining us for this conversation.
It is genuinely wonderful to be here. I mean, we are unpacking a text today that really challenges a lot of our modern sensibilities, but it is incredibly rich if you're willing to look at the mechanics beneath the surface.
For sure. So our mission today is to decode Leviticus chapter 21. And to do that, we are drawing heavily on the insights from two really detailed study resources, the Holman and the NAA study Bibles.
Those fantastic resources.
They really are. And we're using these specific resources because they do just an excellent job of bridging that gap between ancient Near Eastern anthropology and modern theology.
Right. They don't just, tell us what the rules were. They actually explain the historical logic behind them.
Which is so vital because reading Leviticus 21 without that context can be really jarring.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to really grasp the gravity of this text, we have to frame the entire discussion around the ancient concept of holiness.
Okay, let's get into that. Because today I think we tend to view holiness as this, like, internal moral category, right?
Yeah.
Like having pure thoughts or just being a generally ethical person.
Exactly. But in the ancient Near East, holiness was this tangible, physical, and highly social reality. It was a very visible boundary line.
It wasn't just a state of mind.
Not at all. The rules outlined in this chapter were engineered to set Israel's priests apart from the surrounding cultures in ways that literally carried life or death consequences.
And the chapter establishes those boundaries immediately, right off the bat, by addressing the ultimate defilement in this ancient system, human death.
The most universal human experience.
Yeah. The text lays out these incredibly strict rules for the regular priests. It says they cannot defile themselves by coming into contact with a dead body.
Not at all.
Well, there's a very tight exception for immediate blood relatives, a mother, father, son, daughter, brother, and an unmarried virgin sister. But when you read the study notes from the Holman Bible, it highlights a detail that completely short-circuits my modern brain.
I think I know which one you're talking about.
A priest couldn't even prepare his own wife for burial because technically, under this specific legal framework, she wasn't considered a blood relative.
Yeah, that is a tough one to process. And the NABA notes actually corroborate this as well.
That's just so rigid.
It is. While an ordinary layperson in Israel was fully expected to participate in mourning rituals, funerals, the preparation of a body, the common priests, were explicitly prohibited from that basic, deeply human act of grieving a spouse in a hands-on way.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because going back to my trauma surgeon analogy, it feels incredibly harsh to us.
It definitely does.
It feels almost anti-family to bar a man from mourning his partner like that. What is the underlying mechanism here? Why mandate that kind of emotional and physical distance?
Well, what's fascinating here is the intense geopolitical and religious context surrounding Israel at the time. According to the Holman notes, this entire restriction is actually a massive, deliberate polemic against the cult of the dead.
The cult of the dead.
Yeah, which absolutely dominated the ancient Near East.
Right.
You have to consider the cultural superpowers of the era, primarily Egypt.
Right.
The Egyptian worldview was fundamentally a necrocracy, basically, a society ruled by death.
Yeah. Oh, wow, a necrocracy. And that went way beyond just building monuments like the pyramids. Right?
Oh, completely. Their entire economy, their literature, like the Book of the Dead, their complex mummification rituals, everything was oriented towards securing the afterlife and navigating the underworld.
Right. The whole society was obsessed with it.
Exactly that. The Egyptian priesthood spent an enormous amount of its time, resources, and theological energy tending to corpses and preparing tombs.
But they were constantly surrounded by death.
Yes. So in stark contrast, the God of Israel is presenting himself exclusively as the God of the living. By commanding the priest to obsessively avoid death and corpses, God was forcefully demonstrating that his sanctuary had absolutely zero intersection with the cult of the dead.
So it was a statement.
A huge one.
Yeah.
It was a radical, daily rejection of the dominant religious operating system of the ancient world.
That reframes the rule completely for me. It wasn't that God lacked compassion for a priest's grief. It was about preventing the Israelite priesthood from mirroring those Egyptian death cults.
Exactly. It was about setting them totally apart.
But that raises an immediate logistical question, I think. If priests are severely restricted from being around the dead, how do they process grief at all? The text naturally moves from who they can mourn to how they are physically allowed to express that sorrow.
And this is where the restrictions get incredibly granular regarding the physical body.
The details are hyper-specific. The text dictates no shaving the head bald, no shaving the edges of the beard, and no cutting the flesh.
Right.
And honestly, this is where I need to push back a little bit. Why micromanage a haircut?
It sounds absurd to us, I know.
Yeah, because today, a shaved head or a neatly trimmed beard is just a style choice or maybe a hygiene preference. Why is a divine law so deeply concerned with the priest's barbers?
Well, because in the ancient Levant, those grooming choices were not about style or hygiene.
Okay.
Both the NWA and Holman notes clarify that shaving the head, trimming the beard in specific geometric patterns, and especially lacerating the skin, those were highly formalized Canaanite mourning rituals.
Ugh. So it wasn't just crying or looking messy, it was a specific liturgical act.
It was essentially blood magic.
Blood magic? Really?
Yeah. Pagan cultures in the region, particularly those worshipping Bol, or Mot, the god of death, would literally mutilate their own flesh to express extreme sorrow or to get the attention of dead deities.
That is intense.
Very. The underlying belief was that shedding your own blood or violently altering your physical form would appease the spirits of the underworld or manipulate them into granting favor.
Oh, wow. Which perfectly explains why the Israelites were told to avoid it. They are representing a god who doesn't need to be woken up or manipulated by human blood.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the priest's physical body had to remain entirely intact to reflect his devotion to a holy, complete God.
Like a visual theology.
Exactly. It was visual theology. The priest's body was a closed, living system. It was a bodily rejection of the self-harm and the transactional manipulative rituals practiced by the surrounding nations.
Because they represented the author of life.
Exactly. So they simply could not bear the marks of the underworld on their own skin.
So the boundaries around the priest's physical body are incredibly tight. But those boundaries don't stop at his own skin, do they?
No, they don't.
They extend outward into his social structure, specifically who he can build a life with. The text moves from the cemetery to the marriage altar. A regular priest cannot marry a prostitute, a dishonored woman, or a divorced woman.
The standards for the priest's household had to mirror the standards for his own body.
And the burden on that household is immense. The text actually outlines that if a priest's daughter becomes a prostitute, the punishment is that she is to be burned in fire.
Yes, that is a notoriously difficult passage.
Now, I understand the concept of collective family reputation, but I really have to challenge the severity here. Burning. That feels disproportionate even by ancient standards. Is there something specific about the nature of fire in Levitical law that explains this mechanism?
That is a really crucial question, and the study notes help us synthesize the logic behind it.
Okay, good.
First, the NDA notes explain the marriage prohibitions. Divorce wasn't strictly illegal in ancient Israel for the common person, but it carried the stigma of falling short of the ideal of creation, the original design in Eden.
Right.
Because the priests were required to embody the absolute highest standard of that creation ideal, they couldn't enter into a union that carried any social or spiritual ambiguity.
They had to be a walking representation of Eden, like no compromises.
Right. And the Holman note adds the vital cultural lens regarding the daughter. In the ancient world, the family was a single, indivisible unit.
Kind of like a shared spiritual credit score. If one person defaults, the entire household standing is ruined.
That is a brilliant way to put it, actually.
Mm-hmm.
An adult child's actions were not viewed as independent from their parents. A daughter's prostitution didn't just ruin her own social standing, she literally profaned her father, actively desecrating his sacred office. And regarding your question about the fire, the notes point out that cremation or burning was not a standard or accepted practice in Israel. It was an extreme measure reserved exclusively for an extreme violation of holiness.
Because fire purifies.
Well, fire in Leviticus is often associated with the presence of God consuming what is profoundly profane so that it does not infect the sanctuary. The punishment reflects the catastrophic threat her actions pose to the purity of the priesthood itself.
It reinforces that the priesthood wasn't a 9 to 5 job where you just clock out and go home to a normal life. Your entire family was an extension of the tabernacle.
100%.
But if protecting the sanctuary required the regular priests and their families to make these massive sacrifices, what happens when you look at the high priest? The text shifts to his requirements, and the standards just multiply exponentially.
A high priest is the apex of this entire system of boundaries.
The rules for him operate on a completely different, almost superhuman plane. The text says the high priest cannot leave his hair unkempt or tear his clothes, which again were the most basic reflexive expressions of human grief.
He's not allowed to show it.
Right. Furthermore, he cannot go near any dead body, not even his own mother or father.
None.
He cannot leave the sanctuary to mourn them. And when it comes to marriage, his circle shrinks drastically. He doesn't just avoid dishonored or divorced women, he must exclusively marry a virgin from his own people.
The isolation at the top of this hierarchy is staggering when you really think about it.
It makes me think of a level 4 biosafety lab or a modern microchip clean room.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Yeah, the environment inside that room is so meticulously calibrated that the person entering has to be scrubbed, suited up, and constantly isolated to prevent even a microscopic level of outside contamination. The high priest is essentially living in a spiritual clean room.
He really is.
It's the ultimate sacrifice of a private human life for the sake of a public divine duty. He doesn't get the luxury of being a grieving son.
That clean room analogy perfectly captures the mechanics of his existence. And the text tells us exactly why he is required to live in that bubble. It states that the consecration of the anointing oil of his God is upon him. He quite literally embodies the sanctuary.
He is the walking equivalent of the Holy of Holies.
Which means if he were to leave the sanctuary to mourn, or if he were to touch a corpse, he would be bringing the taint of death into the single most sacred space on earth.
Which would be catastrophic.
Exactly. The entire nation's connection to God relied on that space remaining pure. And regarding his marriage, he must marry a virgin from his own people because the high priesthood was hereditary.
Okay, so it's about the lineage.
Right. He cannot risk casting any doubt whatsoever on the legitimacy and purity of his descendants. Any ambiguity about his children's lineage would threaten the structural integrity of Israel's entire religious system.
The psychological burden of carrying that weight is just hard to fathom. And that requirement for absolute wholeness leads us into the final major section of the chapter.
Right, the physical requirements.
Yeah, the text pushes past social behavior and family dynamics, moving directly into human biology. It connects physical wholeness to spiritual readiness, resulting in a list of highly specific physical requirements.
This is traditionally one of the most challenging sections for readers to navigate today.
It really is because it strikes a nerve.
Oh, for sure.
The text states that no descendant of Aaron who has a physical defect can offer the food of God at the altar. It lists conditions like blindness, lameness, a mutilated face, dwarfism, a hunchback, skin diseases, or crushed testicles.
A very blunt list.
Very. And to a modern ear, barring someone from service due to a physical disability or dwarfism sounds deeply discriminatory. It forces us to ask how we interact with ancient texts that operate on a logic so foreign to our own sensibilities.
Well, it requires us to deeply understand the symbolic logic of the sacrificial system.
Tell me more about that.
Just as the animal sacrifices had to be entirely unblemished to represent giving God the absolute best, an outward visual theater of an inward spiritual truth, the priest offering those sacrifices had to physically symbolize that same wholeness and integrity.
So the body was a symbol.
Exactly. In that era, the physical body was a direct metaphor for the spiritual state.
But the text also includes a vital caveat, highlighted by the study notes, that prevents this from just being a cruel exclusion.
Right, and this is where the nuance is essential. These individuals were not cast out of the priesthood, nor were they exiled from the community.
Which is what you might expect in the ancient world.
Exactly. But the text explicitly mandates that they are to be fully supported. They're allowed to eat the most holy food, the exact same divine provisions given to the active ministering priests.
So they still got the perks, in a way.
Yes. They retain their sacred status and their livelihood. They simply could not approach the physical veil or the altar. It was a restriction of specific ritual duty and location, not a rejection of their personhood.
They aren't thrown out into the street, they are still eating the bread of the presence. That distinction changes the tone of the passage considerably.
It really does soften it.
And what is fascinating is how the sources trace the evolution of this concept. The Holman study note points out a massive theological shift over time.
A huge shift.
By the time you reach the New Testament, these strict physical requirements for leaders, ministers, presbyters, bishops, and deacons are entirely dropped. The early church maintains incredibly high moral and spiritual standards, but the physical perfection metric just vanishes.
Because the ultimate unblemished sacrifice Christ had already been offered.
Wow, right.
The visual theater of physical perfection in the priesthood was rendered obsolete. The metaphor had been fulfilled, so the early church could focus entirely on the internal reality that the physical rules were always pointing toward.
And honestly, the study materials provide this fantastic table titled Priests in the Old Testament that proves physical perfection clearly didn't guarantee moral perfection in the first place.
Not at all.
The historical track record of these flawless priests is highly mixed.
It is a striking contrast when you look at the historical accounts.
You have heroic priests on this list like Jehoiada, who literally saved young King Joash from being assassinated and preserved the royal line of David.
Right.
He was physically qualified, yes, but more importantly, he was morally courageous. But then you look further down the list and see a priest like Pashur. Pashur was fully physically qualified to serve at the altar, no blemishes, perfect lineage, but he used his sacred position to violently beat and imprison the prophet Jeremiah.
Yeah, completely corrupt.
Or you look at the sons of Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas, who were perfectly whole in their bodies, but completely corrupt and perverse in their actions at the tabernacle.
They profaned the sacrifices despite passing every single physical test Leviticus 21 required.
Right.
It proved that the physical rules were always a teaching tool. They were meant to point an entire nation toward a deeper, internal reality of holiness. That human beings, even the most physically perfect among them, constantly struggle to maintain.
Which brings us perfectly to our overarching takeaway for this deep dive. When you synthesize all these sources, the historical context of the ancient Near East, the Canaanite rituals, the crushing weight of the high priest's duties, it becomes clear that Leviticus 21 isn't just a list of arbitrary, distant rules.
It's so much more than that.
It is a profound blueprint of what it meant to dedicate one's entire existence to a higher calling. It required a radical daily choice to stand in stark contrast to the death-obsessed, self-mutilating cultures around them. It was about dedicating your mind, your body, your family, and your future to pointing an entire nation toward the God of life.
It is a totalizing commitment. Every haircut, every morning practice, every marriage choice was a testimony.
A full-time testimony.
And that leaves us with a final thought to ponder as we wrap up this exploration. If ancient, strict physical purity was a physical metaphor for the profound reverence required to approach the divine, what is our modern equivalent?
Oh, that is a heavy question.
Well, think about it. We no longer have to worry about avoiding Canaanite grooming habits or the prohibition on mourning our loved ones. The physical theater has been fulfilled, but the underlying requirement for deep, profound reverence remains.
Absolutely.
So how do you prepare yourself to encounter the sacred in an era where we value casual, instant accessibility to absolutely everything? What does it look like to truly set yourself apart today?
That is something incredibly powerful to reflect on this week. We want to thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Leviticus 21. We hope it brought some real clarity and some surprising insights to a challenging ancient text. Until next time, God blesses all the listeners.